man had copies of the codex, that is the version of the Quran that he produced, sent to at least 4 different cities. I mean, I think it's been recognized already in classical scholarship and then early in Western scholarship that this wasn't, he didn't have a scanner. And so the versions that he had written down weren't precisely the same. In very minor ways, in a very limited number of ways, but definite ways, there's differences. So does that sound okay? What would you add to that account of the regions?
Yeah, so that's the exact idea, is basically, you create a master copy, and then you make copies of the master copy, and then you sort of distribute them across the empire. And so the first person to make the actually one important piece is in classical works like Al-Muqni' by Ad-Dani and Abu Ubaid's work, Fada' al-Quran, and things like that, and Farra. So many early classical works mention or record a number of discrepancies between these codices. And I would say, as far as I'm aware, Noldeke was the first person to realize that the pattern formed by those discrepancies, they actually form a stemma. And so what is a stemma? A stemma is essentially sort of a familiar relationship between texts. So if you imagine, if I produce a document and then I give that document to a number of students and tell them to copy it, in the process of copying, so think about not a photocopy or a Xerox machine, but sort of hand copying, different students might introduce different mistakes, right? So they might not copy it perfectly. And then as students of those students make copies, other mistakes will get introduced, and you can trace the lineage and recreate a family tree, essentially, of the relationship between these codices. So what Noldeke noticed initially is that the list of discrepancies between those ascribed to Medina, Sham, so Syria, Basra, and Kufa form a stemma, while Mecca, the list of variants attributed to Mecca stand out a little bit. They don't quite fit in neatly. Now, what Michael Cook does is he sort of takes them and he's a little more critical, and he basically enumerates all possible stemmas that can be formed by those particular variants. Noldeke had basically suggested that the Medinan copy was the archetype from which the other 3 copies were made. And Cook says, well, we can't really be sure about that. So he kind of refines Noldeke's initial proposal. Now, that's all great based on the literary sources, but the question is, does that actually hold true in the sort of material witnesses that we have in the manuscripts? And so that was sort of the impetus behind my work on the regionality of Quranic codices. Now, other folks like Yassine Dutton and Marijn van Putte, they'd sort of studied individual manuscripts, and they'd noticed that, and even De Roche in some of his works, they'd noticed that certain manuscripts, they did more or less follow along in terms of their variants with one regional tradition. So like this manuscript, you can say, is by and large Syrian, etc. But nobody had gone through and sort of surveyed all of the available manuscripts that we have, the early manuscripts, and seen if they actually form a stemma. And if they do form a stemma, how does that compare to the one that Noldeke put forth and that Michael Cook refined? And so that's essentially the core of my project. And so what I do is I sort of look at things in 2 different ways. I say, if we take the traditional literature, and I go through and I collect a lot more variants than what Noldeke and Cook use, which they basically relied on Muqni', which has kind of like a summary list. But I go through earlier works and I collect more of them. And I say, okay, this is sort of the list based on and this is actually another important point, is no 2 classical Muslim scholars agree on a list of variants between the different regional masahif, the different regional codices. Some report 1 or 2, some report long lists between those of Iraq and Medina, and it's a mixed bag. And so what I do is I kind of sift through them and I organize them in a structure, and I separate between well-attested ones in the literature and poorly attested ones. And then what I do is I go to those locations in the manuscripts and I collect all of the variants that are found there. And I don't classify, I just kind of collect the raw data, and I use a technique known as phylogenetic analysis. So It's the same way, we can, take your DNA and your children's DNA and your cousin's DNA, and we can kind of reconstruct a family tree without asking you, is this person your parent? Is this person your cousin? Is this person your sibling? We can know that on the basis of mutations or slight variation and shared genetic material between you and other individuals. And of course, this applies at the level of species as well. We can do this with variants in manuscripts too. And so what I show is, if you take the earliest manuscripts and you reconstruct the family tree, so the stemma from it, it essentially reflects more or less identically what we get from the literary sources. Now, there are, the devil is always in the details. There are some very important details that I do highlight in my paper. So I would say the first one is the fact. So I mentioned that no two, classical sources have the same exact lists of variants. Right. And what's very interesting is we can compare some of the variants that are given in those lists with what we find in manuscripts, and we find discrepancies. So it's not a perfect. The actual variants themselves are not a perfect match, and the discrepancies is they allow us to date when those reports were written, or at the very least, what date the manuscripts that were relied on come from, what time period. Because I guess it's important to mention that Quranic orthography evolved over time. It got sort of upgraded a little bit. So for example, medial alifs like the Malik and Malik example we talked about, as sort of time went on, more often you find the medial alif written in manuscripts to sort of make things more explicit. And there are other things with case vowels as well. And what you find is in the earliest manuscripts that we have, certain words were spelled differently than, say, manuscripts that are about a century later from the 2nd century. And so that kind of gives you an idea that, well, these reports probably don't come from the 1st century, from the sort of contemporaneous to the canonization of the text by Uthman. They come from a time period a little bit later. And then by sort of looking at the pattern and how Muslim scholars documented these variants, I sort of infer that knowledge of these variants sort of emerged organically as people traveled and things like that, and they compared their different codices. They sort of became aware of these minor differences and minor discrepancies and started documenting them systematically. And of course, no two copies of a manuscript are perfectly identical. So someone might be looking at maybe a slightly more archaic manuscript and document things a little bit differently than someone else. And also, of course, as diffusion takes place across the empire, what also happens is people start to pick and choose. Like, I really think this other variant is very nice, so let me put it in my manuscript.
So you get something like hybrid
exactly version. So you get this contamination, what we would call it. It's not a sort of a loaded term, it's just descriptive. But in the same way, even the Hafs tradition, so Hafs, even so the reading traditions, they don't necessarily follow 100% their regional codices. So Hafs violates sort of, or goes against, deviates from the Kufan manuscript in 2 instances as well. So that allows us to sort of get this landscape of what of sort of the regional codices and sort of the emergence of the traditions that document those variants.